All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tearing into the absolute bedrock of the UK Constitution, parliamentary sovereignty. For anyone studying law or political science, you already know this is the gravitational center of the entire British legal system. Because, the UK doesn't have a single codified written constitution. Instead, the whole state basically relies on this incredibly delicate tension between the political reality of Parliament and the legal reality of the courts. We're going to deeply unpack this classic idea that the UK Parliament can make or unmake literally any law, and that absolutely no court can override an act of Parliament. But as you'll see, what sounds like a really straightforward rule gets incredibly complex the second you start asking difficult questions about time, international treaties, and executive power.
Think back to this brilliant quote from the Victorian constitutional scholar A.V. Dicey. He hits the nail on the head and outlines the orthodox rule perfectly. Basically, Dicey established that Parliament holds absolute, unchallengeable legal supremacy. What he's telling us here is that legislation made by Parliament essentially trumps every other form of law. If there's a clash, Parliament's legislation wins, period. And to give you a sense of just how absolute this 19th century idea is, legally speaking, Parliament has the power to legislate on literally anything. They could alter the succession to the throne, or, at least in legal theory, they could pass a law banning smoking on the streets of Paris. Now, practically that's absurd, but legally, it represents the ultimate dominant characteristic of the UK's political institutions.
But hold on a second, this sounds super straightforward until we ask this critical question, which forces us to grapple with the absolute logical paradoxes of an all-powerful legislature. Can a sovereign parliament legally entrench a statute to protect it from future majorities? It's kind of the constitutional equivalent of asking if an omnipotent deity can create a rock so heavy they can't lift it. If Parliament is truly sovereign, can it bind its successors? Can it enact unchangeable laws? And if it restricts its own powers, does it actually lose its sovereign character?
So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. Dicey's orthodox rule, the temporal paradox, the EU supremacy shockwave, the constitutional exception, Miller and executive limits, and finally asking, is sovereignty still absolute? Let's get right into it. Section 1. Dicey's orthodox rule. Let's establish the absolute baseline of the UK Constitution. Basically, Parliament is the undisputed heavyweight champion of lawmaking. Their legislation completely trumps any other form of law, and courts absolutely must obey and apply every single act. There's literally no area of competence into which Parliament cannot enter. If an act of Parliament conflicts with common law made by the courts, the act wins. This absolute power is really backed up by a foundational legal concept known as the Enrolled Bill Rule, which was famously affirmed in the Picken v. British Railways Board case. The Enrolled Bill Rule basically says that courts will not even look behind an act of Parliament to question the internal proceedings or how it was passed. Once an act hits the statute book, the judiciary's only job is to interpret it, never ever to invalidate it. Section 2. The temporal paradox. What happens when a sovereign parliament tries to bind future parliaments?
Well, this brings us to the doctrine of implied repeal. Imagine a past parliament passes a law, right? And then a current parliament passes a brand new law that completely contradicts it, but they just forget to explicitly repeal the old one. Now, courts absolutely loathe implied repeal. They will do everything in their interpretive power to read statutes so they get along. However, if the conflict is just fundamentally irreconcilable, as an absolute last resort, the courts apply the later act. The earlier act is taken to be repealed by implication, just to the extent of that inconsistency. We see this perfectly in the 1934 Ellen Street Estates case. This whole thing involved housing compensation. Property developers basically wanted their compensation calculated under the super generous terms of an older 1919 Act, and they argued it couldn't be overridden by a much less generous 1925 Act. But Lord Justice Maugham wasn't having it. He strictly applied the 1925 Act, ruling that the legislature simply cannot bind itself as to the form of subsequent legislation. A present parliament literally cannot tie the hands of its successors. Why? Well, because if a parliament could protect its own statutes from being repealed by a later parliament, then that later parliament wouldn't be sovereign anymore. Preserving sovereignty means it has to be preserved across time.
Section 3. The EU supremacy shockwave. Let's see how European Union membership threw a massive wrench into this established doctrine.
We've got a timeline tracking the infamous factor tone drama. This is where an act of the UK Parliament directly clashed with European law. So, the UK passed the European Communities Act in 1972. Fast forward to 1988, Parliament passes the Merchant Shipping Act. This was specifically designed to stop Spanish fishermen from registering their boats in the UK and claiming UK fishing quotas. But this created a direct, undeniable head-on collision with EU anti-discrimination laws. According to Dicey, and that doctrine of implied repeal we just talked about, the later 1988 Act should have simply crushed the earlier 1972 EU provisions, right?
But it didn't. The factor tame decision was an absolute constitutional shockwave. The House of Lords actually suspended the operation of the 1988 Act of Parliament because directly effective EU law took precedence. No way, right? To justify this without claiming to destroy UK sovereignty entirely, Lord Bridge had to perform some incredible legal gymnastics. He argued that the 1972 Act was a voluntary limitation of sovereignty. By passing it, Parliament essentially inserted a rule of construction into all future statutes, directing courts to prioritize EU law unless Parliament expressly and explicitly stated it wanted to violate it. Regardless of how they rationalized it, practically speaking, a UK court had just disapplied a UK statute.
Section 4. The constitutional exception. How exactly did the courts square this new reality with Dicey's old rule?
Enter the monumental 2002 Thorburn case. Here, Lord Justice Laws created a brand new distinction that changed the game. He suggested there are actually two types of statutes, ordinary and constitutional. A constitutional statute defines fundamental rights or state relationships. We're talking big stuff. Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, 1689, the Human Rights Act, 1998, the Devolution Acts, and, the 1972 European Communities Act. And here's the magic trick, a completely radical common law creation by the judiciary. Constitutional statutes are immune from the doctrine of implied repeal. To repeal or alter them, Parliament actually has to use express, specific words proving an actual determination to change them. An accidental clash just won't cut it anymore. The courts essentially built a protective wall around fundamental rights.
Section 5. Miller and Executive Limits. This brings us right into the Brexit era, where the threat to parliamentary sovereignty came not from Europe, but from the UK's own executive branch.
To really get this, we have to define the royal prerogative. These are the historic powers of the Crown, which are mostly used today by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to manage foreign affairs, make treaties, and sometimes even manage the functioning of Parliament itself. The crucial complexity here is the democratic deficit of the prerogative. It's a power exercised by ministers without prior parliamentary approval. And guess what? The government tried to use these exact powers to bypass Parliament to trigger Brexit, and later to suspend Parliament altogether. This set the stage for an epic constitutional showdown.
So, the two famous Miller cases. Now, regardless of where you stand politically, legally, these cases were not really about stopping Brexit. They were deeply rooted in defending parliamentary sovereignty from executive overreach. In Miller 1, the government argued they could use prerogative powers to withdraw from EU treaties. The Supreme Court said, no way, because doing so would inevitably destroy domestic statutory rights created by Parliament's 1972 Act. Only Parliament can unmake its own laws. Then, in Miller 2, the government tried to prorogue, or suspend Parliament for 5 whole weeks. The court unanimously ruled that was unlawful. They reasoned that this specific prorogation completely frustrated Parliament's core constitutional role of executive accountability and did so without any reasonable justification.
Now, that 8-3 split in Miller I is super telling. The Supreme Court ruled against the government by a majority of 8-3, which really highlights that constitutional questions remain deeply contested even at the absolute highest levels of the judiciary. It was an incredibly complex tension between two accepted rules. Yes, the executive handles foreign treaties, but only Parliament can change domestic law. The dissenting judges, most notably Lord Reed, argued that the courts were actually overstepping into political territory here. He suggested that these are matters that should be resolved by political pressure, not by sweeping legal rulings.
But the big takeaway from this is a robust reinforcement of the separation of powers. The courts actively disarmed the executive to protect the fundamental rule that only Parliament can change domestic law. It firmly reinforced that the royal prerogative is not a blank check. When the executive takes actions that undermine the democratic legislature, the judiciary will absolutely step in to act as a crucial check on the executive branch, actively working to preserve the legislative branch's ultimate authority.
Section 6. Is sovereignty still absolute? After everything we've just covered, implied repeal, the shock of EU supremacy in factor tame, the creation of constitutional statutes in Thorburn, and those massive executive clashes in the Miller cases, we have to ask the ultimate question.
To really get at this, let's look at the 2005 Jackson case. This involved a challenge to the Hunting Act 2004, which banned fox hunting. It was challenged because it was passed using the Parliament Acts to completely bypass the House of Lords.
Now, in his ruling, Lord Steyne made some incredible comments. In law, we call this obiter dicta, basically statements made in passing by a judge that aren't strictly legally binding, but man, are they highly persuasive. He argued that parliamentary sovereignty isn't some divine right. It is a judicial construct, literally a product of the common law. He hinted at this crazy nuclear option, suggesting that if a parliament tried to pass a truly tyrannical law, like attempting to abolish judicial review entirely or dismantle democracy itself, the courts might finally say no and simply refuse to apply it.
So, we've seen the courts grapple with this in real time, balancing the immense power of the legislature against the rights of the public and the overreach of the executive. We've gone all the way from Dicey's absolute rule to a highly nuanced modern reality where courts distinguish between types of statutes and actively limit prerogative powers. The landscape has fundamentally shifted. The UK Constitution clearly relies not on a single document, but on an ongoing, super dynamic tension and a delicate balance of power between Parliament, the executive, and the courts. And that leaves us with his final thought to ponder. If the courts are the ones who ultimately define and protect the limits of Parliament, where does ultimate power truly reside? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I really encourage you to keep questioning the structures of power around us. See you next time.